Celeste sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched into fists beneath the table, trying to ignore the low chuckle that echoed from the front row. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. She could feel his presence, the same way she had felt it in every room he had ever cornered her in. Officer Travis Holt leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, his smirk unmistakable. He thought this was funny. He thought he had already won. Then the judge spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Officer Holt, do you find something amusing?" The laughter stopped. And for the first time, Celeste saw something flicker across Travis's face, uncertainty. He wasn't in control anymore. The courtroom was filled with the usual tension of a high-stakes trial, but Celeste Blake barely heard the murmurs of the crowd. She sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. The charges against her were serious: assaulting a police officer. If convicted, she could face years in prison. But the weight pressing down on her chest wasn't just fear of the verdict. It was the presence of the man sitting in the front row, grinning at her like this was nothing more than a game. Officer Travis Holt. She hadn't seen him in months, but the sight of him now made her stomach twist in knots. He was still the same, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp and his badge polished like a trophy. He had always carried himself with an air of superiority, like the world belonged to him and he was gracious enough to allow others to exist in it. And now, he was watching her, his blue eyes glinting with amusement, as if this entire situation was one big joke. Celeste clenched her jaw, forcing herself to look away. Judge Michael Cross entered the courtroom, his presence demanding immediate silence. He was a well-respected judge, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and commitment to the law. He took his seat at the bench, adjusting his robe before scanning the room. His sharp eyes settled on Celeste for a moment, then moved to the prosecution table, where the district attorney sat beside Travis. The judge glanced at the case file in front of him. "We are here today to hear the case of the state versus Celeste Blake. The defendant is charged with assaulting Officer Travis Holt during a traffic stop. Prosecution, you may proceed." The district attorney stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Officer Holt was conducting a routine stop when the defendant became aggressive and physically attacked him. The officer was merely doing his job when he was assaulted without provocation." Celeste's hands curled into fists beneath the table. Lies. Every word of it. She forced herself to stay silent as her lawyer, Julia Ramirez, stood up. "Your Honor, my client maintains that she acted in self-defense. Furthermore, we have reason to believe that Officer Holt's actions leading up to the incident were inappropriate and abusive." A soft chuckle echoed through the courtroom. Celeste knew exactly who it came from. Judge Cross's head snapped up. His gaze landed on Travis, who leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, still smirking. "Is something amusing to you, Officer Holt?" Travis shook his head, but the grin didn't fade. "No, Your Honor. Just surprised to hear my actions being questioned." Judge Cross didn't look convinced. "You are a witness in this case. I expect you to behave accordingly." Celeste could feel the shift in the room. The judge had noticed Travis's arrogance, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a flicker of hope. Julia continued. "Your Honor, we have evidence to suggest that Officer Holt had a personal connection to my client prior to this incident. We believe this case is not as clear-cut as the prosecution claims." Judge Cross raised an eyebrow. "A personal connection?" Julia nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Officer Holt and my client were previously in a romantic relationship. And that relationship was complicated." Celeste could hear the whispers spreading through the courtroom. She didn't need to turn around to know that all eyes were now on her. Judge Cross studied her for a moment, then turned to Travis. "Is this true, Officer Holt?" Travis's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "We dated a long time ago, Your Honor. It has nothing to do with this case." Julia didn't hesitate. "Actually, Your Honor, it has everything to do with this case. Because Officer Holt didn't just date my client, he harassed her after she left him. He followed her, showed up at her workplace uninvited, and used his badge to intimidate her. And when she refused to give him what he wanted, he used the law against her." The courtroom erupted into murmurs again. Judge Cross's gaze darkened. He tapped his gavel once, silencing the noise. Then, he leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Ramirez, do you have proof of these allegations?" Julia glanced at Celeste, then back at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor. We do." And with those words, Celeste knew that everything was about to change. The moment Julia Ramirez uttered those words, the entire courtroom shifted. The murmurs grew louder, people whispering, eyes darting between Celeste and Travis. Judge Cross remained still, his gaze locked on Julia, his expression unreadable. Celeste felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The moment where everything either turned in her favor or collapsed entirely. Judge Cross tapped his gavel once, silencing the room. "Proceed." Julia took a breath and walked toward the evidence table. "Your Honor, we have multiple pieces of evidence demonstrating Officer Holt's repeated harassment of my client. First, I would like to submit phone records showing over 50 calls and text messages from Officer Holt to Ms. Blake after their relationship ended. Many of these messages were sent late at night, despite my client asking him multiple times to stop contacting her." The prosecutor immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant to the case. The defendant is on trial for assaulting an officer, not for past relationship issues." Judge Cross turned his sharp gaze toward the prosecutor. "I disagree. If Officer Holt used his authority to intimidate the defendant prior to this incident, it speaks to motive and potential misconduct." Objection overruled. Julia nodded and continued. "Additionally, we have video footage from a surveillance camera outside my client's workplace, showing Officer Holt parking near the entrance and waiting for her to leave on multiple occasions. We also have a written complaint that Ms. Blake filed against Officer Holt with the Internal Affairs Division 6 months ago, an official complaint that, I might add, was never properly investigated." Celeste kept her eyes focused on her lap, her hands tightly clenched. She knew all of this was true, but hearing it presented in court made her feel exposed. The world was finally seeing what she had lived through, but it didn't make it any easier. Judge Cross looked at Julia. "You claim Internal Affairs did not investigate this complaint?" Julia nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. They dismissed it without interviewing my client or reviewing the evidence she submitted." The judge's expression hardened as he turned his attention to Travis. "Officer Holt, do you have an explanation for this?" Travis, who had been sitting in smug silence up until now, finally straightened in his chair. "Your Honor, she's twisting the story. Yes, I contacted her, but I was trying to reconcile. I cared about her, and I wanted to fix things. As for the complaint, it was baseless. I never harmed her. I never abused my position." Julia didn't hesitate. "Yet, when she rejected you, you continued to follow her, and now, conveniently, she's sitting in this courtroom facing a charge based solely on your word?" Travis clenched his jaw. "She attacked me." Julia walked toward the defense table and pressed a button on her laptop. The courtroom screen flickered to life. "Your Honor, here is security footage from the night of the alleged assault. This video was retrieved from a nearby traffic camera." The video began to play. Celeste forced herself to watch, even though she had already seen it multiple times. The footage showed Celeste walking to her car in a nearly empty parking lot. Travis appeared seconds later, approaching her with a casual but deliberate stride. He reached for her wrist. She pulled away. He grabbed her arm harder. The sound was muted, but even without it, the aggression was clear. Celeste yanked back, trying to free herself. Then Travis shoved her, causing her to stumble. Her hand flew up, making contact with his chest, not as an attack, but as a defensive move. And then, just like that, the video ended. Silence fell over the courtroom. Julia let the moment sink in before speaking. That is what Officer Holt considers an assault. The prosecutor was already scrambling. Your Honor, the video does not show what led up to this event. We don't know what the defendant may have said or done prior to the recording. Judge Cross leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I see enough. He turned his gaze back to Travis. Officer Holt, you testified under oath that the defendant attacked you. That video tells a very different story. Travis's face was red now, his confidence cracking. She resisted. Resisted what? Julia asked. Being harassed? Judge Cross straightened his posture, his expression unreadable but firm. Officer Holt, I need you to be very careful with your next words. Did you or did you not initiate physical contact with Ms. Blake that night? Travis hesitated for just a second too long. The courtroom knew it. The judge knew it. And in that moment, Celeste saw something she had never expected, fear in Travis's eyes. Judge Cross turned to the prosecutor. I need a moment to deliberate. Celeste inhaled sharply. She knew this was far from over. But for the first time since she walked into the courtroom, she felt something close to hope. Judge Cross sat back in his chair, his fingers interlocked as he studied Travis Holt. The entire courtroom was silent, the weight of the evidence hanging heavily in the air. Celeste could feel her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had spent months fearing this man, dreading the moment he would use his power against her in a way she couldn't fight. But now, for the first time, she saw the cracks forming in his armor. Travis shifted in his seat, his usual confidence faltering. His face was tight with frustration, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Celeste had seen that look before. It was the same look he used to give her when she refused to let him control her, when she stood up for herself and made it clear she wasn't going to let him manipulate her anymore. Judge Cross tapped his fingers against the bench before finally speaking. Officer Holt, your testimony states that the defendant assaulted you without provocation. Yet, the video evidence suggests otherwise. It appears that you initiated contact with Ms. Blake, and her actions were in response to that. Travis's jaw tightened. Your Honor, I was trying to de-escalate the situation. She was being uncooperative. Julia Ramirez immediately stood up. Uncooperative? She was walking to her car. You had no legal reason to approach her in the first place. Travis let out a sharp breath through his nose. She and I have history. I was trying to talk to her. That's all. Judge Cross leaned forward. Your history is not relevant in the eyes of the law, Officer Holt. What is relevant is that you used your position as a police officer to engage in behavior that could be interpreted as harassment. You then used your authority to file charges against the defendant, claiming an assault that, based on this video, did not happen as you described. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor looked increasingly uncomfortable, flipping through his notes as if trying to find an argument strong enough to salvage the case. Celeste gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. She had imagined this moment so many times, dreamed of the day someone would finally believe her. But now that it was happening, it felt surreal. Judge Cross turned back to Julia. Ms. Ramirez, do you have any additional evidence to submit? Julia nodded and held up another document. Yes, Your Honor. These are additional complaints filed against Officer Holt by other women in the past 2 years. While these were never officially investigated, they show a pattern of behavior, harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. All women of color. All dismissed. Travis shot up from his seat. This is ridiculous. Those complaints were baseless. These women were looking for attention. Judge Cross's eyes darkened. Sit down, Officer Holt. Travis hesitated, his nostrils flaring, but then slowly lowered himself back into his seat. The judge glanced at the documents before setting them down with deliberate slowness. I am disturbed by what I've seen here today. This court is not a tool for personal vendettas. Law enforcement officers are expected to uphold justice, not manipulate it for their own benefit. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, with all due respect, we would like additional time to review this evidence before making any decisions. Judge Cross raised a hand, silencing him. No additional time is needed. I have seen enough. Celeste's breath caught. The judge turned his gaze toward her, his expression softer than before. Ms. Blake, based on the evidence presented, I see no legitimate grounds for the charges against you. This case should never have reached trial in the first place. The charges are hereby dismissed. A collective gasp spread through the courtroom. Celeste felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly made her dizzy. But Judge Cross wasn't finished. He turned back to Travis. As for you, Officer Holt, I am referring this case to Internal Affairs for further investigation. Your actions, both on the night of the alleged assault and in this courtroom, raise serious concerns about your ability to serve as a police officer. Travis's face turned red. This is a witch hunt. You're taking her side because she's playing the victim. Judge Cross's expression remained cold. This hearing is over. Bailiff, escort Officer Holt out of my courtroom. The bailiff approached, standing beside Travis. For a long moment, Travis didn't move. His fists clenched at his sides, his glare locked onto Celeste as if she were responsible for his downfall. But she didn't look away. She met his eyes with quiet defiance, refusing to let him intimidate her any longer. Then, with a sharp exhale, Travis turned and stormed out of the courtroom. Celeste felt her entire body go numb as the reality of what had just happened settled in. She was free. The charges were dropped. Travis was finally being held accountable. Julia placed a hand on her shoulder. It's over. Celeste exhaled slowly. Not yet. But it's a start. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in years, she felt something close to hope. The days following the trial felt surreal. Celeste had spent so long preparing for the worst that waking up without the weight of an impending conviction felt strange. She no longer had to check her phone constantly, fearing another message from Travis or another unexpected legal twist. The fear wasn't gone entirely, but it had lessened, and for the first time in months, she could breathe. Malik insisted that she stay with him for a while, just until everything settled. She hadn't argued. Her apartment didn't feel safe anymore, not with the memories of Travis showing up unannounced, knocking on her door like he still had control over her life. Being at Malik's place gave her a sense of security, something she hadn't realized she had been missing. She spent most of her time scrolling through news articles about the case. It had gained more attention than she expected. Reporters were digging into Travis's history, uncovering more complaints that had been ignored, more instances of abuse that had been swept under the rug. Some former victims had come forward, emboldened by what had happened in court. Celeste read their stories, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. She wasn't alone. She never had been. One afternoon, Julia called with an update. They've put Travis on unpaid leave while Internal Affairs investigates, she said. It's a step in the right direction, but don't expect a quick resolution. Cases like this take time. Celeste sighed, leaning against the kitchen counter. And if they don't fire him? Then we push harder, Julia said firmly. But right now, you don't need to worry about that. You did everything you needed to do. The system is finally looking at him for what he is. Celeste wasn't sure she believed in the system, but she wanted to. Later that night, Malik sat with her on the couch, flipping through TV channels while she scrolled through her phone. A notification popped up, an anonymous message from a number she didn't recognize. "You think you won, but this isn't over." Her stomach twisted. Malik must have noticed her face because he leaned in. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then handed him the phone. His expression darkened as he read the message. "He's still trying to get in your head," he muttered. Celeste swallowed hard. What if he does more than that? Malik's jaw tightened. Then he'll regret it. She wanted to believe him, but the fear lingered. Travis had lost control in the courtroom, but that didn't mean he would give up. If anything, it made him more dangerous. She took a deep breath and deleted the message. She wasn't going to let him scare her anymore. But she also wasn't going to pretend the fight was over. Because deep down, she knew, Travis wasn't finished. Not yet. Celeste didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in Malik's guest room, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled in knots. The message from Travis played over and over in her mind. It wasn't just a threat, it was a reminder that he still believed he had control over her. That even after everything, he thought he could keep her afraid. She refused to let him win. By morning, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to sit around waiting for Travis to make his next move. She needed to take action, to make sure that no matter what he tried, he would never be able to hurt her, or anyone else, again. She found Malik in the kitchen, pouring coffee, his expression still dark from the night before. He glanced up as she walked in. "You okay?" Celeste nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "I need to go to the police station." Malik set his cup down with a sharp clink. "For what?" She took a breath. "To file a restraining order. To make sure that if he tries anything, there's a record of it." Malik studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll go with you." The police station was a place Celeste had never felt comfortable. Too many bad memories, too many encounters that had left her feeling powerless. But as she stepped inside, she straightened her shoulders. She wasn't here as a victim. She was here to fight back. The officer at the front desk was polite but detached, treating her request like routine paperwork. "You'll need to provide any evidence of harassment or threats," he said as he handed her a form. Celeste pulled out her phone and showed him the message. "This came from an unlisted number, but I know it's him." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "We can add this to your file. Since he's already under investigation, this will be taken seriously." That wasn't as reassuring as she wanted it to be. After filing the paperwork, she and Malik walked out of the station into the bright afternoon sun. Celeste exhaled, feeling lighter but still uneasy. Malik looked at her. "What now?" She hesitated, then spoke the thought that had been forming in her mind all night. "I want to talk to the other women he's harassed." Malik frowned. "You sure that's a good idea?" She nodded. "If we come together, if we speak out as one, they won't be able to ignore it. Internal Affairs might be investigating, but I don't trust them to do the right thing. If we put enough pressure on them, they won't have a choice." Malik studied her, then sighed. "You're really not going to let this go, are you?" "No," she said firmly. "Because if I do, he'll just do this to someone else." Later that night, she started making calls. She reached out to the women who had filed complaints against Travis in the past, the ones whose cases had been dismissed. Some of them were hesitant, afraid of speaking up again, afraid of what might happen if they did. But others were angry, tired of being ignored, ready to fight. By the time she hung up the last call, she had a list of women willing to stand with her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. And now, Travis was going to learn what it felt like to be the one on the other side of the fear. Celeste sat at Malik's dining table, her laptop open in front of her, emails and messages filling the screen. The women she had reached out to were responding, some hesitant, some furious, some relieved that they were finally being heard. Each story she read made her stomach tighten. Travis hadn't just harassed her. He had done this for years, to multiple women, using his badge as a shield to protect himself. She had always known she wasn't alone. But seeing the evidence, the sheer number of victims, made it real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. Malik walked in from the kitchen, setting down a cup of tea in front of her. "You've been at this for hours. You need a break." She shook her head, scrolling through yet another message. "I can't. This is bigger than me now. These women have been ignored for too long." He sat across from her, rubbing his hands together. "And what's your plan? You've got their stories, but what do you do with them?" She had already thought about that. "We take it public. We tell our stories together, make sure people listen. The department might try to sweep this under the rug, but if enough of us come forward at once, they won't be able to ignore it." Malik sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You know what's going to happen, right? They'll try to discredit you. They'll call you angry, say you're exaggerating, make it seem like this is personal." Celeste met his gaze. "It is personal. And that's exactly why I won't stop." She took a deep breath and opened a new document, typing the words that would start it all: "We are speaking out." The statement was simple but powerful. She drafted a letter, carefully crafting each word, making sure their voices were heard. Then she sent it to the women who had agreed to come forward, asking them to add their names. Within hours, the responses flooded in. By morning, the letter had been signed by over a dozen women. Now, it was time to make sure the world saw it. She sent the letter to local news outlets, attached the files, and hit send. Malik leaned against the table, watching her. "You sure you're ready for this?" Celeste let out a slow breath. "No. But I'm doing it anyway." By noon, the first news station had picked up the story. By evening, it was everywhere. Travis Holt's name was finally being exposed for what it really was, not a respected officer, but a predator hiding behind a badge. And Celeste? She wasn't afraid anymore. Celeste woke up to her phone vibrating on the nightstand. It had been ringing non-stop since the story broke. News articles, social media posts, and even national outlets had picked it up. Travis Holt was no longer just a name on a police roster, he was now the face of a growing scandal, one that the department could no longer ignore. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes as she scrolled through the messages. Some were from reporters asking for interviews, others from people she didn't know, victims of abuse, survivors of similar situations, strangers thanking her for speaking out. The support was overwhelming, but so were the threats. Malik knocked on the door before stepping inside. "It's everywhere," he said, holding up his phone. "They just aired a segment on the morning news. Internal Affairs is launching a full investigation. Looks like Holt is officially suspended." Celeste let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Suspended isn't fired." Malik sat down beside her. "It's a start. And this time, they can't cover for him. There are too many eyes on this now." She nodded, but a part of her still felt uneasy. Travis wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. If she had learned anything from her time with him, it was that he always had a way of twisting things in his favor. Her phone rang again, this time with a number she recognized. "Julia Ramirez." She answered quickly. "What's the update?" Julia's voice was steady but firm. "They're calling for his resignation. The department wants to avoid a bigger scandal, so they're pressuring him to step down before the investigation digs up more dirt. But there's a problem." Celeste tensed. What is it? Julia hesitated. He's refusing. He's claiming that this is all a coordinated attack, that you and the other women are lying to ruin his career. He's saying he's going to fight back. Celeste closed her eyes, forcing down the frustration building inside her. Of course he is. I need you to be careful, Julia continued. If he feels like he has nothing to lose, he might try something reckless. I don't trust him to go down without a fight. Celeste clenched her jaw. Neither do I. Malik, who had been listening, crossed his arms. If he tries anything, he'll regret it. Celeste looked at her brother, appreciating his protectiveness, but she knew this was her battle to fight. She had come too far to back down now. I'm not stopping, she said into the phone. If he wants to fight back, let him. He's already lost. He just doesn't know it yet. Julia exhaled. Good. Because we're not stopping either. By the time she hung up, Celeste felt the weight of what was happening settle in. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. She opened her phone, looked at the news headlines, and saw her name next to the words "Brave Survivor Speaks Out." Travis Holt's reign of intimidation was ending. And she was the one who had taken it down. The ending of this story is powerful because it isn't just about Celeste winning, it's about taking back control. For so long, Travis Holt used his power to intimidate, manipulate, and silence her, believing he was untouchable. But in the end, it wasn't just the legal system that brought him down, it was the voices of the women he had hurt, standing together, refusing to be ignored any longer. What makes this conclusion satisfying is that it doesn't rely on a single moment of justice, like a dramatic courtroom scene where everything is neatly wrapped up. Instead, it shows the real, messy, and relentless fight for accountability. Travis didn't immediately lose everything, he fought back, tried to discredit Celeste, tried to shift blame, just as abusers in power often do. But the truth, once exposed, became too big for even him to control. The system, which had once protected him, could no longer ignore the weight of the evidence against him. Celeste's arc is especially powerful because she didn't just fight for herself, she fought for all the other women who had been silenced. By uniting them, by refusing to let their stories be buried, she created a movement that went beyond her own personal battle. That's what makes her victory so meaningful. She didn't just survive. She made sure that Travis Holt would never have the chance to hurt anyone else again. The most important part of this ending is that Celeste is not defined by her trauma anymore. She started as a woman being controlled, fearing what Travis might do next. But she ends as someone who has reclaimed her power, standing in the spotlight on her own terms. She's no longer just a survivor, she's a force of change It's a story about justice, yes, but more than that, it's about resilience, courage, and the power of speaking out, even when the odds are stacked against you. Celeste's journey proves that abusers can be exposed, systems can be challenged, and no one is truly untouchable when the truth comes to light.